Hello, welcome to today's webinar, Envisioning Climate Change-Related Financial Risks Using Scenario Planning. First, I would like to thank everyone for joining us. I know we have a bit of an international audience, so again, thank you for taking the time to attend today's webinar. A bit about myself, my name is Whitney, and I'm an analyst at VitalMetrics Group, and I help our clients with greenhouse gas emissions calculations along with their CDP reporting. So a bit about VitalMetrics. We are a sustainability consulting company specializing in environmental impact measurement and metrics. We have been an accredited provider and partner of CDP for 4 years now. And we have also developed web-based solutions for greenhouse gas emissions calculations, and these results can be easily applied to your CDP reporting. So in line with our mission to help organizations reduce the impacts of their products and activities, we also calculate our own carbon footprint. So this allows us to reduce as much as we can and offset what we can't mitigate. So we're pleased to say that today's webinar is carbon neutral. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. So we have Dr. Sang-Won Soo, who's the Chief Scientist at VitalMetrics Group. He served as a coordinating lead author of the IPCC and was a member of the working group that developed the Greenhouse Gas Protocol by WRI, which is the standard used by CDP. He is also a professor in environmental science and management at UCSB. And we're also pleased to have Dr. Nicole Dando with us today as a speaker representing CDP. She is the Deputy Associate Director at CDP and has worked with CDP for over 3 years in the reporting team, with a particular focus on CDP's water security disclosure. She has a background in promoting best practice in corporate ethics, sustainability, and accountability, and she was recently a member of the Better Alignment Project within the Corporate Reporting Dialogue. And this project mapped the reporting frameworks of CDP, GRI, and SASB against each other and the TCFD recommendations. So again, thank you, Nicole, for joining us. And now for our agenda. So first off, Dr. Dando will go over the CDP updates, and then she and Dr. Soo will go over the climate-related financial risks. And then Dr. Soo will go over how to conduct a scenario analysis and the key takeaways. We'll end with a Q&A. So if you have any questions during this presentation, please go ahead and enter your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll address those at the end. And now I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Dando.
Thank you, Whitney. So as Whitney said, my name is Nicole Dando, and I work in the UK office of CDP. I work in the reporting team, which is responsible for the development of our questionnaires. So I was just going to say a little bit about CDP. So CDP is a non-profit organisation. We work globally to secure a thriving economy, and we do this through the power of information to drive better decision making. So we have 3 questionnaires: climate change, water security, and forests. And we probably have the world's biggest environmental data set now, from both companies and also from the cities, states, and regions that supply data to us. And importantly, I think we engage across many networks, from investors to the policy community, and we leverage the insights that our data brings with those stakeholders. So I think it helps to explain some of what CDP does using numbers. There's a little bit of a delay when I am flicking through slides, so apologies for that. There we go. So how do we work? These numbers here relate to our 2019 disclosure. So you can see that we have 525 investors who request data through us, with 96, or a lot of assets, 96 trillion US dollars of assets covered by them. We also have 120 more large purchasing companies. They are supply chain members to CDP. They ask, we supply information to them on their supply chain. And you can see there that in 2019, over 8,000 companies responded through CDP. and as I said, we have also over 800 cities disclosing environmental information to us, and 120 states and regions. So you can see on this graph gives a little bit about the history of CDP. We started in 2003, and you can see the growth in disclosure that CDP has generated. So the wealth of data now and information that is available to the economy and to our stakeholders to make better decisions. You can see at around 2010 there, we introduced the water security questionnaire. And a few years later, we introduced forest disclosure as well, looking at deforestation through commodities. So we've grown immensely, and one of the things we're very proud of at CDP is driving the standardization of sustainability reporting to improve the quality of data. So that's a little bit about the background of CDP. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Su, who's going to talk about the specifically climate-related financial risks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dando. About 3 years ago, when Mr. Mark Carney said that the catastrophic impacts of climate change will be felt beyond the traditional horizons of most banks, investors, and financial policymakers, few people believe that this will come true, and many people were not sure whether this was too strong, or whether this is the reality. But it seems that the tide has shifted, and now more and more investors feel that climate change related financial risks are real, and they started to look into the climate change related financial risks more seriously, especially those investors who have been investing in companies like PG&E couldn't have felt this risk more severely than others. PG&E, as many of you know, has filed a Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection earlier this year due to the lawsuits against the power line related wildfires. And their share price plunged from about $70 per share. Now I think it's about $6 per share. It is not only in California. This morning I just heard the news that the New South Wales of Southern Australia is also suffering from an unprecedented scale of wildfire, and many scientists already warned the increasing frequency of wildfires in the course of climate change. So many of us think that, well, wildfire is probably the largest risk of economic risks of climate change, but no. Some of the scientists analyzed that it's not the wildfire, but it is actually rising sea levels posing bigger economic threat than wildfires, or even the earthquakes. About 10 years ago, when I moved to California, I thought that earthquake might be the largest risk that I'm assuming by moving, but I didn't see the wildfire coming, and also sea level rise. I didn't think about that. What did I know? So those are the physical risks. So imagine that this prime real estate here is inundated with flooding in the course of climate change. What are the financial risks if you are the asset holders in this prime real estate? So those are the financial risks, the physical risks. But what about transition risks? So the graph on the left is showing the range of carbon price that are currently exercised by different countries, and most of the countries are exercising their carbon prices well below $30 per ton of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. So these are the countries. This is magnification of the bottom of this chart. So most of the countries belong to this range. So $0 to $25. And obviously many countries don't even have any carbon price. But the blue bracket over here is the range of carbon prices that we think that is needed as the floor in order to implement the 2020, in order to implement the nationally determined contributions NDCs of the Paris Agreement by 2020, which is now like next month. That means that in order for us to implement the Paris Agreement, basically, for most of the countries, their carbon prices have to be doubled or tripled. But what if the carbon price has to go up even further going forward? For example, Sweden currently is the only country that exercising over $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. But IPCC scenarios and integrated assessments shows that in order for us to make a deep cut in greenhouse gas emissions, much higher level of carbon prices would be needed. So what would that mean in terms of my organization throughout the transition process? So here goes a poll question. I will go hand it over back to Whitney.
So thank you, Dr. Su. So in line with this conversation that we're having right now, and just to kick us off in this webinar, we wanted to ask you a question of if you've taken the steps to understand the impacts of carbon pricing on your organization. So I'm going to share a poll with you and give you 30 seconds to answer, and then we'll review the questions together, or the results together afterwards. Okay, I'm going to share the results. So it looks like a majority have not taken any steps to understand the impacts of carbon pricing, but it's great to see that some, are working on this, or you've measured the direct emissions, but no one has taken considered the impacts of supply chain. Or I guess two have done both, but it's great to see that there are some companies here taking steps to measure those impacts. I'm going to now hand it off to Dr. Su.
It's great. It's very encouraging. So here goes the TCFD. TCFD stands for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and it provides a guidance on how to measure climate change-related financial risks. And there were 20 investment companies working together with the UN Environment and released a report about 2 months ago called Changing Course, and that report shows that the portfolio value at risk amounts to about $10.7 trillion from low carbon economy transition under the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario. It's not only about the risks that climate change and transition toward low carbon economy poses, but also there is a green profit opportunity of $2.1 trillion. So we now know that TCFD has been incorporated into CDP questionnaire. I would like to ask again Dr. Dando to tell us about how TCFD has been included in CDP questionnaire.
Thank you. Yes, so CDP committed to align its questionnaires with the TCFD recommendations while they were being developed. We recognised the important potential of the TCFD to mainstream climate-related information and also to advance the availability of financially relevant information for global markets. So the TCFD recommendations actually help ensure that climate information is integrated into mainstream financial reports. And this is an important part of the roadmap for meeting the commitments of the Paris Agreement. So for our questionnaires, this meant introducing a sectoral focus. Sorry, the slides jumped. Sectoral focus, which we started doing in our 2018 questionnaires, and adopting a more forward-looking approach to climate risk disclosure. So, for example, new questions were introduced asking about the use of or the planned use of a scenario analysis, and that was all part of that. So moving to more sector-based disclosure for some sectors, requesting more forward-looking metrics around transition, and then integrating the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure recommendations into our whole disclosure platform. So that is indeed what we did do. We committed to that, and we delivered that in 2018. So the next slide shows an example of some of the recommendations, the 11 TCFD recommendations, some of them they're listed on the right, governance recommended disclosure A, B, and strategy and risk management. And you can see the equivalent climate change question number and the question text. So if we just take the second row, for example, the governance recommendation is describe management's role in assessing and managing climate related risks. And we have below the board level, provide the highest level management positions. So we went through the TCFD and incorporated the majority of that into our questionnaires. So going forward, we will be completing that alignment with our 2020 questionnaires by introducing new sector questions on the remaining sectors that weren't already covered. So this will be financial services sector, the real estate sector, construction and capital goods. So those will be new questions, new data points being introduced into the climate change questionnaire soon. And these will be on our website from December the 16th. So this slide, moving on to my final slide, lists some more useful materials that you can find on the TCFD. We have a technical note. We also have a technical note on scenario analysis, which you can find by typing into your search engine. If you type CDP technical note scenario analysis, you will find that. You will find the TCFD one by doing the same. There's also a link there to the CRD, Corporate Reporting Dialogue, Better Alignment Project, and this is the project which Whitney mentioned right at the beginning of the webinar that I was involved in, and GRI, SASB and CDP have mapped together their climate-related disclosure against the TCFD and against each other. So we looked at the metrics and see to the extent to which we align and the extent to which there were gaps. And that report, if you're interested, you can find that on the website there. And there is also a TCFD knowledge hub that I wanted to point you to that has lots of useful information on the TCFD recommendations, training courses, background documents very clearly laid out. So that's really useful. And I would like to hand over back now to Dr. Sue, who's going to talk us through scenario analysis practically.
Thank you, Dr. Dando. It seems that there are a lot of materials already available on those websites. So the question now is how to do scenario analysis. Basically, scenario analysis is at the heart of the understanding the climate change related financial risks. Scenarios are coherent, internally consistent, and plausible description of possible future states, and it is important to realize that they are not forecasts. Why do we do scenario analysis? Is because we want to understand the potential climate change related risks, and we want to identify potential opportunities as well. I think what is important to realize is that even if we implement all the nationally determined contributions of the Paris Agreement and take additional measures to combat climate change, to stay in this green curve over here on the graph on the right, which is in line with a 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario, there still is a small chance that the global mean temperature creeps up to 3.2 or 4 degrees Celsius around here, which is a catastrophic level. These are some of the low probability, high impact events that we know that organizations are least prepared for. So do we have to reconfigure our strategy based on the low probability event scenarios? Probably not. But do we want to understand what it means to my organization if that happens? I think the answer is yes. And that is what scenarios are all about. So it is not about forecasts, but it is about what if questions. Although there still are large uncertainties, science has advanced to the state that we now better understand the impact of climate change at a much finer spatial resolution. We also know that some regions are much more severely impacted by temperature and precipitation anomalies, and also extreme weather events than other areas. So how does that scientific knowledge will translate to physical risks of climate change to my organization, that is what is shown on the left when we are developing scenarios. So first, we want to understand what are the physical risks and opportunities. We want to look into not only just the most probable future states, but also what are the possible extreme cases. That is, for a little bit of simplification, and these are the kind of events that we want to factor in based on the locations our facilities are and our suppliers are, etc., and also our clients are. And what are the transitional risks and opportunities that is on the middle part of this graph? And that includes policy and legal scenarios and technology scenarios and market scenarios. And we want to understand those scenarios on the basis of the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario, 2 degrees Celsius scenario, and business as usual scenarios on their 4 degree or even 6 or 8 degrees Celsius scenarios. One of the transition scenarios on the policy section would be the carbon pricing. So what if carbon pricing is exercised at a much larger scale across the supply chain? What does that mean to my organization in terms of the supply of raw materials and an affordability and accessibility of raw materials and services that I need? And what are the technological changes and scenarios associated with that? Would that include changes in the energy mix in the future under various different scenarios? And what does that mean to my organization? And how does that translate to the market conditions? What are the revenue potential? What are the demand and supply of goods and services? And what are the prices affected by those transitions? And those are the transition risks and opportunities that we want to factor in when we are developing scenarios. As you can imagine, if we combine the multiple scenarios by each column, we end up with a large number of combinations of scenarios. And that's actually what gives us the range in the final result on the financial risks associated with the climate change. Some of the key considerations, obviously, there are lots of things to think about when we are developing these scenarios. A few things that I wanted to highlight is obviously carbon price and price of goods and services associated with those carbon pricing as well as the climate change risks. And also policy-related changes, for example, regulatory policy. What we are seeing in California is that, well, it is quite inevitable that electricity price will have to go up. Utilities, in large extent, is a public goods, and now PG&E is bearing a lot of cost, and then eventually those costs will be passed down to the ratepayers, and that is something that we have to brace ourselves about. In terms of analytical choices, definitely we want to look at what are the climate models and data sets that are available out there, what are the scientific understandings of the impact of climate change. And that will lead us to a better understanding of the climate risks of various kinds. In terms of business impact and effect, we want to look at the cost fluctuations as well as business interruptions. They will lead us to a better understanding of the climate change related risks, including transition risks and physical risks, as well as the opportunities. Combining those two will help us to guide the strategic planning and risk management. Whitney?
So now for our second and final poll question. We would like to understand what range of carbon prices has your organization tested. So again, I'm launching the poll and I'll give you 30 seconds to answer. Okay, so now I'm going to share the results. So it seems that for those of you who have tested or considered carbon pricing, impacts, the range of carbon prices that you tested tend to be on the less conservative side. But still exciting again to see that you're taking this consideration into account. So I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Su.
That's great. So now let's think about, how we actually implement the scenario analysis in actual decision making, and how the climate change related scenarios can affect our investment decisions. As an example, this is very simplified example, obviously, but let's think about a coastal infrastructure investment project. And in the course of normal financial planning or project planning, we are doing scenario analysis even without thinking about climate change. And we have been doing this, investment communities have been doing this for years. And in those scenarios, we think about the best case scenario under high demand with low financial cost, and also average case scenarios, let's say average demand, average financial cost, and worst case scenarios as well. And based on these scenario exercises, suppose that the net project value that we calculated was ranging from 200 million positive under the best case scenario to 50 million positive under the worst case scenario. So if we didn't factor in the climate change related risks, well, all these scenarios were very favorable to this coastal infrastructure investment project. But what if the climate change has a negative financial risk of $100 million from, let's say, flooding? Well, in that case, the best case scenario, the net project value under the best case scenario is reduced to 100 million. Average case is basically profit neutral, and worst case is negative 50, loss of $50 million. So all of a sudden, we see that, well, the project is much less favorable and attractive to us. Obviously, this type of analysis can be done not only on the basis of the physical risks, but also in terms of transition risks. Transition risks need to be quantified throughout the scope 1, 2, 3. So why that's the case? The greenhouse gas emissions, just to explain what are the scope 1, 2, 3. Scope 1 emissions, as you know, is the direct greenhouse gas emissions from my facility. Scope 2 is the greenhouse gas emissions from the purchased electricity and utility, and scope 3 is basically all the rest. If the carbon price is exercised throughout the supply chain, what does that mean is that, well, basically the carbon price need to be borne by the price of the goods and services that I will be buying, and also that will be borne in the price of my goods and services to be sold to my clients. So carbon pricing and transition risks associated with the carbon pricing need to be captured throughout all scopes of greenhouse gas emissions. So here goes with the key takeaways. And to just summarize the today's webinar, I hope that now you are convinced that climate change poses tangible and substantial financial risks. And I think one of the global trend now we are seeing is a gradual internalization of environmental externalities. Greenhouse gas emissions, we didn't pay for that, although we knew that there are negative adverse impact of greenhouse gas emissions, but more and more countries are internalizing those external environmental costs to the firms and activities that generate those greenhouse gas emissions. I think this is a global trend that is very difficult to unturn. Therefore, gauging the externality risks across the supply chain is crucial, and scenarios help understand the magnitude of exposure to climate change related financial risks. So what are our recommendations? We recommend you to develop and test various scenarios, and that scenarios would include transition risks as well as physical risks. And I think it will be crucial to integrate science, the recent sciences on climate change. We also recommend you to quantify scope 1, 2, 3 emissions and gauge the transition risks across all scopes. I would like to leave this webinar with you with one question, which is that, is my organization prepared to measure and manage climate change related financial risks? I want you to think about this, and I hope that today's webinar was helpful in thinking through this question. Back to Whitney.
So now I'd like to open it up to Q&A. So if you have any questions for our presenters today, go ahead and enter your questions into the Q&A box. It should be located at the bottom of the screen. And we can go ahead and answer those for you. So one of the questions we have that have come in is, if your organization has limited resources, what type of scenarios would you recommend be evaluated first?
Okay, I can take that question. I think that it will be very difficult to generalize what kind of scenarios that organizations should prioritize. I think it depends on the location and type of business that they are in. But obviously, the TCFD recommend developing scenarios for at least one for the 2 degrees Celsius or less. So those aggressive transition scenarios need to be included. I think one business as usual case, such as 4 degrees Celsius or 6 degrees Celsius scenario, would be also useful. Depending on the business and location, again, some of the companies are exposed to disproportionately larger level of physical risks, and those things I think should be factored in as well.
Okay, thank you. And then another question, thinking of PG&E, if you were like an investor of PG&E or PG&E itself, what could have been done differently in their situation?
Yeah, I think that is a tough question. So, yeah, Warren Buffett once said that, well, everything looks clear in the side mirror, indicating that, well, once things are all past, then, well, you know, we understand why things happened the way that it did. But obviously, when we are in the situation, it's very difficult to really understand what's really going on. Having said that, I think that it was 2006 when the Science article came out showing the relationship between the wildfire risks and frequency with the climate change. So the scientists knew that there is a relationship, very close relationship between the wildfire frequency and with climate change. And it was also, I think, around 2005, 2006, when the San Diego utility had to pay for the losses of wildfire due to the power line initiated wildfire at that time. So if we were able to connect those dots, I think that we should have known better. We knew better, I think, about the potential risks associated with climate change for PG&E. So obviously, this is in retrospect much clearer. But I think that you know, if we were able to connect those dots, probably we could have been better prepared.
Yes, if I can say something, I think that it illustrates it's a very good example of you know, forward-looking best practice risk assessment. You know, incorporating climate-related risks into your mainstream risk assessments. I have no idea whether they the strength of their risk assessment processes back then, but certainly that would have meant that they understood where their risks lay, and then they could investigate the best approach for managing and responding to those risks.
That's a great point. And I also wanted to point out that PG&E really topped most of the ESG investment ratings. Women in the board and the renewables in the grid, all those aspects were one of the best in the class. So it's very unfortunate that 2 years ago this fire happened. But this also reminds us that there is a greater need for us to incorporate best class science into our scenario planning. The traditional checklist-based ESG rating system, I think it needs to evolve into embracing more science-based analysis into it. I think we are moving forward to it.
Okay, it looks like we have one more question. Again, if you have any other questions, feel free to enter them into the Q&A box, but there's just been one more that's been sent in. And the question is, how do you take into account the risk regarding population migration or government instability?
I think this is an excellent question. We are seeing more and more climate-related climate refugees, and not only because of the temperature and climate-related changes, but also the climate change and precipitation pattern changes. It involves the food price increases and yield decrease in some of the regions. These people are migrating not only because of the climate, but because there is no food, affordable food that they can rely on. I think this is going to be even more severe problem as we go forward. So how do we account for this? This is, I think, great question. I think depending on the business you are in and where your suppliers are located, I think this could be something that definitely need to be incorporated into the scenario planning.
Okay, so it looks like we have no more questions for today. So again, thank you to our speakers, Dr. Su and Dr. Danda, for taking time to present on this topic, and thank you all for joining. We will be sharing a recording of the webinar with you all, as well as a copy of the slides, so look out for that later. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.